All right, so let's go ahead and get started for today. We have a lot of fantastic information that we're going to be able to provide all of you. And all of you are also going to have a chance to ask any questions that you have to us and all of the panelists. So first of all, welcome everyone. Today we're hosting a webinar on strategies and techniques to ace the BioBiochem and PsychSoc sections of the MCAT. So I want to start first by introducing the other panelists that we have with us here today. So if each of you want to go ahead and introduce yourselves. Rishav, if you want to go ahead and go first.
Sure. Hi guys, I'm Rishav. I'm a Biochem and Chem physics tutor with med school coach. I graduated from Duke University in 2016. I studied biology. Since then, I've been working as a high school teacher, and I'll be starting med school this fall. It's nice meeting all of you.
All right, so I'll go next. My name is Katherine, and I actually tutor all of the sections for the MCAT. So I've been doing this in my gap year, which is before medical school. So I've been working on my application, and I'm applying now. And I recently graduated from the University of Miami in 2018. And it'll be great getting to know all of you through this session.
Hi everyone, I'm Key. I just recently graduated in December from Johns Hopkins, and I am also going to med school in the fall, and I also tutor all 4 sections.
All right, great. So as you can see, we have some very fantastic panelists with us here, and as you can see on this slide, all 3 of them are 99th percentile MCAT scores. So they're definitely going to be able to provide very helpful tips and strategies for these 2 sections today. So here is the outline for today. We're going to start off with a quick introduction of the MCAT for those of you who aren't familiar with the test format. From there, we're going to talk a bit about the BioBiochem sections and PsychSoc sections, what makes these sections particularly difficult for students, and then we'll go into the tips from our panelists about how you can better prepare for these sections. And then we're going to chat a little bit about how med school coach tutoring can help you prepare for the MCAT. And from there, we're going to spend the rest of the session doing a roundtable Q&A where we're going to be answering your questions. So if you look at the Zoom platform, you might notice that there's a Q&A feature. So I highly encourage all of you to go ahead and submit questions that you have regarding the presentation or anything about studying for the MCAT using that Q&A feature, and we'll be answering questions at the end. All right, so to start off, the MCAT. So as you can see here, the MCAT has 4 sections. Each section has a very long name, which I'm not going to say, but you can read it on the slide. You can also see in terms of scores, each section is scored between 118 to 132, with 125 being an average score. So if a student scores 125 on all 4 sections of the exam, they will be left with a 500. So the idea of this is that it allows medical schools to very quickly identify if this is a student who is above average, meaning that they scored above 500, or if they're below average, if they scored below 500. A couple other points to note. The MCAT is a very unique standardized exam among the pre-health exams in that it's not just freestanding questions asking students to recall scientific content. A lot of the questions on the MCAT are actually based on passages. And in these passages, they're going to introduce new information and new situations that students are not familiar with before. And students who are going to be expected to apply their knowledge of science to these passages in order to get the questions correct. So that is one reason why the MCAT can actually be a pretty tough exam. And a couple minor points on the MCAT, it's a multiple choice test. Every question is worth the same amount of points, and there are no guessing penalties. All right, so from there, let's jump into the focus of today, the first section, the BioBiochem section. So you can see here, it's also called the Biological and Biochemical Foundations of Living Systems. Several reasons for why the BioBiochem section can be particularly tough. So you can see, first of all, it covers a broad range of topics. You can see these on the bottom left. It's 65% biology, 25% biochemistry, 5% general chemistry, and 5% organic chemistry, right? So it's really cramming in 4 different subjects in one section. So that can be a lot for students to handle. But what actually makes it more difficult is that within each subject, there are so many content topics that are tested. So for example, biology is generally divided into two halves. The first half is molecular biology. So you have all of the biology on the small stuff. So bacteria, cells, genetics, viruses, and so forth. And the second half is on physiology. So this is looking at all of the organ systems. So the nervous system, the cardiovascular system, the excretory system, and so forth. And this is a lot of content. And for most students, if they take only the bare minimum in terms of MCAT prerequisite courses, this means that they'll take 1 year of general biology. And while that 1 year of general biology will cover most of the topics tested on the MCAT in terms of biology, it often will not cover these topics to sufficient depth. So often, the students who are majoring in the sciences, such as biology majors, often have an advantage here because they've taken some more advanced biology courses like genetics, cell biology, endocrinology, physiology, and these can give them sort of an upper hand when it comes to preparing for the BioBiochem section. The second reason why the BioBiochem section can be challenging is that it requires a complex set of reasoning skills. So as I mentioned before, the MCAT isn't just about rote memorization. If you just memorize a bunch of terms and concepts, you're not guaranteed to do well on the exam. And you can see here on the bottom right, the MCAT has set up 4 different skills in their questions. So you have questions that do require knowledge of scientific concepts and principles. This is based on more rote memorization, but you also have questions about scientific reasoning and problem solving. So in these cases, you're going to read the passage, and the passage is often going to have some key terms that students are expected to be able to recognize from their studying of science. And when they read those key terms, sort of a light bulb should go off and essentially make them recognize that this passage is providing some sort of clue or hint that's going to be able to help them answer an MCAT question. And the latter 2 skills you can see here, design and execution of research, and data-based and statistical reasoning. This is actually a skill that a lot of students don't have as much experience with, and this manifests on the MCAT as these complex research passages. So quite a number of passages on the science sections of the exam are adapted from peer-reviewed scientific journal articles. And for students who have research experience, you might have read some of these scientific journal articles before, and you're familiar with the sort of scientific jargon you see in the MCAT, and you're also used to seeing these figures of a Western blot gel, or seeing the result of an image taken of a particular cell with some fluorescence intensity. So for students who have this research background, certainly this research aspect of the BioBiochem section isn't so bad, but for students who don't have this experience, it can make this section quite challenging. Okay, so that's BioBiochem. I now want to chat a bit about the PsychSoc section. So the PsychSoc section has its own challenges involved. So the first is that the PsychSoc section tests a lot of vocabulary terms and names, and these do have to be memorized, and our panelists today are going to give you some fantastic tips about how to deal with this. But one of the challenging aspects of memorizing all these terms and names is that at this point, we don't actually fully know all of the terms and names that the MCAT actually wants students to know for the MCAT. And the reason why is because the PsychSoc section is the newest section of the exam. And the way that we find out what students should know for the PsychSoc section is from the information that the AAMC provides us. And this is generally in the form of practice questions from previous MCAT exams. And the PsychSoc section, being the newest section of the exam, there are the fewest number of practice questions available for this section. So we know a good amount about what the MCAT wants students to know for the PsychSoc section, but right now we don't have really all of the information that the MCAT wants students to know. So that can make it a little challenging for students with this section to figure out what are the terms and names that they do or do not need to know for this section. Another aspect, of course, is research-focused passages. Again, just like the BioBiochem section, the PsychSoc section has a number of these passages from scientific journal articles. Again, if you don't have research experience, this might be a little challenging for you. And the last part is exam fatigue. And I mention this because, as you know, the MCAT has 4 sections, and the PsychSoc section is the last section. And most students aren't used to taking a 7-hour exam, or possibly 7 hours and a half if you're counting all the breaks and the surveys. So for a lot of students, by the time they get to the PsychSoc section, their brains are a bit wiped out. So that's something to keep in mind for the PsychSoc section. Even though it's the last section of the exam, it has its own score. So it counts as 25% of the exam and is weighted just as heavily as the 3 other sections of the exam. So while you might be tired, it's still important to do well in this section. Okay. So with that, I want to go ahead and hand this off to our panelists. So we're going to go ahead and start off with Rishabh, who's going to tell us a bit about how you can ace the BioBiochem section.
Hi guys. So my first tip for you for the BioBiochem section is something related to what Ken talked about earlier about these research-based passages. That since this new format of the exam came out in 2015, what we've noticed over the past 4 years is that the MCAT is focusing more and more on these passages that are actually based on scientific papers from scientific journals that will present to you a set of basic science experiments. And for many students, these can be the most difficult passages to deal with. The good thing is that these passages oftentimes require less outside knowledge than a traditional information-based passage. But you should read them a little bit differently than you would like a normal CARS passage or a normal just set of information passage. And so especially for those students that don't have much experience reading scientific articles, and if you have 6 months, a year or more before you take the MCAT, that's a good idea to start gaining some experience reading these types of passages. And so I would suggest that if you can, start reading like cover publications of really major journals like Nature or Cell in your free time, just so you can get used to reading information presented in this kind of unique format. And then when you're taking these passages, something that I always tell my students is that in a research paper, really some of the most important things, some of the most important information is in the figures, the graphs, the tables. And so each of these figures or graphs oftentimes corresponds to a specific experiment that the authors have conducted. And so for my students, when they're reading through the passages, I like to have them, for each figure, really summarize what is the experimental setup that's associated with this figure. What is the independent variable? What is the dependent variable? And are there any results that just looking at this graph stand out to you? And so that's like a sentence or two. Sometimes they even write it out if they have the time to. But for every figure, really just be able to summarize briefly what that figure is trying to tell you. The one exception to this is that sometimes you'll have like a table that has just 5 or 6, 7, 8 different columns, and it's really, really dense in information. And for tables like that, I don't like my students to go through and analyze the entire table while they're reading the first time, because there's a good chance that all of the columns will be covered in the problems. And so if it's a really dense figure with a lot of information, you should understand what the experiment is. You should understand what the different treatments are, but wait to really analyze the nitty-gritty of the data until you encounter a problem that might ask you about a specific part of that table. And the last tip for these types of passages is that oftentimes you'll be presented with a really complex signaling pathway that you are not expected to know going into the test. That's something that's unique to this researcher or this article. And so, and oftentimes this will involve a lot of abbreviations. So it'll say like enzyme ABC activates enzyme XYZ, and that turns on transcription factors 1 and transcription factors 2, which turn on gene XYZ. And so I think sometimes students get really intimidated by these abbreviations and the amount of the number of different things happening at once. And so for these types of passages, something that I suggest to my students is to draw a signaling pathway. So something that just maps out what turns on what and what inhibits what. And just having that available to you as you go through the problems is often a useful tool that will help you condense this really complex, kind of scary, intimidating signaling pathway. And so those are my tips for passages that are research-based.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. So what Rishabh was describing was really fantastic, that reading these publications from these journal articles can really help you familiarize yourself with the MCAT itself. So when you see the MCAT, it's sort of the reverse of what you read in a journal article, that they'll present you the data and you're expected to figure out what are the appropriate conclusions that you can make from the data. But when you read a journal article, everything is laid out for you. So you can really read the text and compare it with the figure and see, were you able to make the same conclusions that the authors of the paper did? So great.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. So the second tip really has to do less with how to read a passage and more how you should prepare for this section while you're studying. And so when you study, you should really use these consensus high-yield strategies that we know help you to retain information for the long term, especially because there's so much information that is tested on the BioBiochem section. And so something that I really emphasize to my students is that when you're building a study schedule, make sure you build in time into that schedule to review concepts that you've already learned before. That it's very unlikely that you'll remember an entire textbook of information just by seeing that information once. But if you see that information a second time or third time spaced out over a few days or a few weeks, it's much more likely that you'll retain that information for the long term. And so some of my students prefer doing this as like an hour of review every day before they go into their new studying. Some students will do all the review at the end of the week and say every Sunday I'll just spend reviewing the stuff I learned this week. Either way is fine, but make sure you're reviewing constantly. Another tip for like retention for long term is to really commit certain frequently tested concepts to memory. And so examples of these will be like your amino acids, your metabolic pathways, your biochemistry laboratory techniques. But these things we know are tested very often by the MCAT. And so in my case, like every morning I'd wake up and for amino acids and my metabolic pathways, I would just kind of sketch those out. Every morning. It took me about 15 minutes. And because I did that for a month or 2 months, it really helped me to have that information in the back of my mind on every problem I did in the MCAT. And that was really useful for me. The next thing is that because this section is so information dense, that instead of taking notes that are just a list of facts, that if you can organize your notes into concept maps, into Venn diagrams, different charts that really compare and contrast the information that you're understanding, organize them into systems that make sense. That these notes are probably, like making these notes are going to help you remember this information more, and those notes will be more useful when you're going back and reviewing. So for example, if you're learning transcription, maybe it's a good idea to compare and contrast using a Venn diagram transcription in eukaryotes versus prokaryotes. And that will probably help you remember this information better if you can make a diagram like that. And my last tip is that if you encounter something that's especially difficult for you to memorize, for me, I remember this was like the different phases of the menstrual cycle and all the hormones that are involved in the menstrual cycle, that if you can take a system like that and chart it out, explain it to a friend or a family member and see if you can teach it to them, that you're much more likely to remember it in the long term. And so try taking the things that are especially tough and teaching them to somebody else. And there's a good chance that you remember them better. And my last tip is that when you're studying, you should really make the most out of these AAMC practice materials. So the AAMC is the organization that publishes the MCAT, and they've released a set of practice materials, practice questions, to help you in your studying. And these are generally agreed upon that they're the best practice questions to use when you're studying. And so make sure you're making the most out of these. And so something I'd suggest is that when you're studying, try to complete 59 questions at a time and give yourself about 95 minutes to do those questions. So this is representative of a standard BioBiochem section on the MCAT. Some students will do a passage, and immediately after the passage, they'll go back and review the passage, and then do the next passage, and immediately after that passage, review that passage. And I don't think that's a very useful strategy because you don't get a sense of how to pace yourself for a 95-minute section. You don't develop the endurance skills that you really need to take this really long exam. And so really treat these questions, when you're doing these questions, simulate actual MCAT conditions. Pace yourself the way that you would on the MCAT. Do it in a quiet room where you're not being distracted by others. And then when you're taking these questions, try out different pacing strategies to see what works for you. I have some students that really struggle with completing all those passages in that 95-minute time span, and other students will have 30 minutes left over when they finish that section, and neither of those is appropriate. That you shouldn't be finishing so far in advance, but you should be finishing close to that 95 minutes with maybe 5 or 10 minutes left over at the end to review. And so you're going to encounter a lot of different pacing strategies online, in your books, and so try out different pacing strategies and see which one works best for you. And then my last tip is that after you take these questions, you should really use these questions to identify the areas of weakness that you have. That pretty much everyone, when they've gone through an entire textbook or months of content review, there's going to be certain topics that they understand really well and certain topics that they've forgotten. And the difficulty is figuring out what are those topics that you've forgotten so you can go back and review them. And so the way you should do that is for every question that you either get wrong or every question that you weren't 100% sure on the answer for, but you might have gotten right because you guessed. For all those questions, go back and review those questions. Make sure you understand why every wrong answer choice is wrong and why every correct answer choice is correct. And keep track of what topics those questions tend to appear in. So for example, if you find that you get a lot of hormone questions wrong, then there's a really good chance that you should go back and review your endocrinology chapter in your book. And so use those review problems to really guide, use those practice problems to really guide your review and figure out what topics that you need to work on. And those are my tips for the BioBiochem section.
All right, great. Thank you, Rishabh. So fantastic recommendations. I hope all of you paid a lot of attention there. We're now going to do sort of a transition as we start switching from BioBiochem over to PsychSoc. So we're going to have Key go next. He's going to give us some tips for both of these sections. I'll hand it off to Key.
Alrighty. Hi, everybody. So just a couple tips about Bio and Biochem. The first is to take content review seriously. And kind of that sounds basic, but one question that I've gotten from multiple people is, hey, I'm a biology major, or hey, my college's pre-med office required me to take 3 biology classes. Can I just kind of skip that and move on to things that I might have more trouble with? And my answer is emphatically no, for a few different reasons. And first, like Ken talked about, it covers a lot of material. And that material bleeds over into the other sections as well. On the slide that Ken showed about the Psych and Soc section, you'll see that 5% of that section is biology content. And so there's a lot to know. It's really not worth getting overconfident about taking this section. There are also a couple of nuances to kind of keep in mind. And one is the MCAT, the AAMC have sort of a certain frame of reference that you want to kind of orient yourself towards. And one example of that is when I was taking biochemistry, for instance, we were learning about inhibitors. My professor said, you have mixed inhibitors and you have non-competitive inhibitors, and for the sake of this class, we're just going to consider both the same. And he's allowed to say that because he has tenure. But on the MCAT, they're kind of 2 different topics. And so, that's one example of how, even though you may have taken a class or, think you understand the material, you really want to kind of go through the resources available to you and sort of orient yourself to what the MCAT asks of you. And the second is, like Rishabh talked about in great detail, you want to understand experimental design, specifically because the MCAT is a passage-based exam. And so if you don't have a research background, if you haven't worked in a lab or have taken a number of research-based or lab-based classes, like he said, identify some research papers, go through those, try and familiarize yourself with analyzing experiments, understanding how experiment design works, and looking at their results, their tables, their figures, and kind of seeing how you can dissect those in a way that makes sense to you. And moving on to Psych and Soc, the first thing is flashcards are your friends. Part of the challenge with this section is that the material is so broad. There's so many concepts that you need to understand, so many names, so many vocabulary terms like Ken talked about. And so you want to keep reviewing them. If you're studying for 3 months, 6 months, the terms that you will have learned in the first week, you'll have forgotten by the time you've taken the test. And so one strategy that I particularly used and that I kind of encourage all of my students to use is make physical flashcards and carry them around with you. I use them, on the bus. I study them while walking to class, just to refresh myself and make sure I don't forget any of the concepts that I've studied. So, that I would truly, truly recommend. Flashcards are your friends. And secondly, one thing that some people, actually a lot of people, tend to miss is that this section requires you to know the people associated with the concepts. Kind of going through science and science classes, reading textbooks. A lot of textbooks start with, Archimedes was an old Greek dude who liked water, X, Y, and Z, and you tend to skip that stuff and move on to the science portion of it. Psych and Soc doesn't quite work like that. If you've taken an intro class, you'll know that psychologists and sociologists love their people. And so I would encourage you not to ignore those parts of the content and to associate the people with the ideas, know who goes with whom, with what concepts, and so on and so forth.
All right, thank you, Key.
Sure.
So next we have Katherine, who's going to talk more about the PsychSoc section.
All right, so great job, Key. I liked all of your tips, and I'll just get started and talk about a few things that I thought about for the PsychSoc section that I wanted to pass on to you. So the first thing is you want to address any content issues that you have really early on. And the best way to do this is by reading textbooks. So we know that the PsychSoc section is highly memorization based. We talked about that throughout this session already, so you should really understand that by now. But really the best way is by reading books, because you have the full outline of what the MCAT exam makers want you to know. But as Ken said, we don't know exactly everything, but the books are the best resource that we have. So reading through the entire thing without skipping is very important. I also recommend that as students do get closer to their test date, there are a few other resources I recommend for content review. So MCAT Bros put together some Khan Academy notes that are about 100 pages, and I always recommend that my students read through that leading up to test day, because it brings back a lot of the content from the books just in a more succinct way. And then finally, so basically you should review the terms several times throughout your studies. So I like what Key said about the flashcards. You can do that. For me, I like writing things down. So I liked making study sheets with all the information on them, and I would review those pretty frequently. So those are my tips for content. All right, next, my tips about reading the passages and the questions. So many of my students will say, oh, I finished the PsychSoc section in 30 minutes, and that's great and all, but you probably missed a lot of things. This is one of those sections where students get a lot of questions right. So even if you miss a few things due to not reading, it really sets you back. So you must carefully read the passage and the question stem to pick which answer is the best fit. So if you read through the question stem too quickly, you might start to automatically associate in your mind one answer choice when really it's something else. And I do have an example of this. So a few weeks ago, I was tutoring a student, and they chose for an answer conflict theory because the question stem mentioned conflict. But it actually had nothing to do with conflict, and if you read the whole question stem, you would have understood that it was a different answer choice altogether. So a careful read is very, very important for this section in particular. And I want you to use the extra time to your advantage. So if you are one of those people who finish early, definitely just take the time to first go back to the questions that you flagged and reread those, reread the passages, and make sure you're getting them right. And then go back and actually go through the whole exam one more time. Make sure you read every question correctly and just reread your answer and your question out loud. And then finally, just process of elimination is very important. So read out loud what your question stem is and read out loud your answer, and make sure that they make sense, and make sure that all the other answer choices do not make sense. And that will get you a lot of points on test day. All right, so those are my tips about reading in the PsychSoc section. So we can move on to my last tips about the figures and data skills. So here is where the MCAT is becoming very critically thinking based for this section. So they expect you to be able to reason about what experiments are going on, what results we have, and then drawing conclusions from what we see in the tables. So we have to first think about the conclusions that they present to us in the passage. So if the authors of the passage concluded something, highlight it. It'll really save you a lot of time when you're going back and reading the questions to automatically have the major findings highlighted. Okay, and then next, when you're analyzing a graph, jot down a few notes, and this will really help you for answering the questions. And it also makes a lot of sense to take notes on things like this because, as you might know, if you're a little bit far along in your MCAT studies, your working memory can only hold so many things at once, especially in your short-term memory. So if you write it down, you're able to critically think at a higher level because you have less that you're trying to hold in one place in your brain. Okay, and then finally, axes are very important, labels are very important, and trends in the PsychSoc section are going to be, oh, is this positively correlated, negatively correlated? So paying attention to the axes, how variables are related, it's always very important. So it is something basic, but when you're looking at a graph, try to at least take a look at the axes and look at the data and find the major trends before you move on when you're reading. Okay, so those are my tips for the PsychSoc section. So just to reiterate, it is you need to be getting all your content in. You need to make sure that you're reading everything very, very carefully because one little reading error can mean a missed question, and this is a portion of the exam where a missed question does penalize you a lot because a lot of students get questions right in this section. And then finally, really work on your figures and data skills and make sure that you're looking for all the trends that are available to you in the passage. All right.
All right, great. So again, excellent tips. So thank you, Katherine. One other thing I want to add from what she was talking about with answer choices for the PsychSoc section. One common trap that the AIMC will often lay out is you'll see different terms for the answer choices, and not all of the terms are going to be real terms. So that's where the rote memorization really becomes important because sometimes students fall in this trap of, oh, I've never heard of C before. So, you know, since I don't know what C is, maybe that's the answer, but that's almost always wrong. So it is important to make sure that you have all those terms and names, as Key mentioned, memorized very well. All right. So at this point, I want to pause real quick and just remind everyone that if you have questions that you want to ask our panelists here today, please make sure that you're using the Q&A feature. We have quite a number of questions that have been submitted already, but I also see a number of you have been typing questions in the chat. Just make sure you're submitting your questions in the Q&A feature, so that way we'll make sure we get you as many of those questions as we can today. So what I want to talk about now is how med school coaches one-on-one tutoring can help. So first of all, for med school coaches program, it's actually a full program. It's not just tutoring. We also provide all of the resources that students need to succeed on the exam. So that includes a fantastic MCAT video course created by curve setters who are all 99th percentile MCAT scores as well. This video course was created brand new for the new MCAT, so it's not the recycled videos you see from a lot of other companies. And for our tutors, as you've heard from our panelists today, our tutors are extremely qualified. So when you look at other companies, often their standards for their tutors can be a bit lower. So we don't settle for that. We really want to make sure that our tutors have taken the exam, they've done fantastic on the exam, and also that they're exceptional teachers, that they're able to communicate their knowledge of science and strategies and techniques for the exam effectively to our students. Okay, so a little bit about how things work with us. So when a student signs up for us, we ask the student to complete an intake form. The intake form is going to ask the student a number of questions, so we get to know about their background. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What are their goals? And using that information, we pair the student up with a tutor that is going to be a good fit for him or her. And once the pairing happens, then our tutor is going to go ahead and reach out to the student, and together they're going to do whatever it takes to help the student reach their target score. So this can involve helping the student understand challenging or difficult content topics, or how to think about content the way that they should be for the MCAT, or going over strategies and techniques. So for a lot of students, when they're taking the MCAT, they often have the content knowledge, but they sort of get stuck on the exam. They read a question stem and they're just not sure what to do next. So here we can certainly help a lot with the strategy. And of course, the last thing I do want to mention is that our program has been very successful. So the average score improvement for our students has been 10 points, which is a lot more than what a lot of other test prep companies can say. So the last thing I have here is just some more details about our satisfaction guarantee, score increase guarantee. We absolutely want our students to succeed and to be happy with the med school coach. So if you have more questions about our program or want to learn more, feel free to check out our website at medschoolcoach.com. And if you have any questions about our MCAT tutoring program, please feel free to email us at info@medschoolcoach.com. All right, and I also want to mention that this presentation will be up on our YouTube channel. So certainly if there was some part of the presentation you missed or you wanted to review later, certainly check out our YouTube page, just looking up Med School Coach. So what we're going to spend the remaining time of this session is answering your questions. So again, if you have questions, make sure to submit them in the Q&A. So let's see what we have. All right, so here we have a question, which is, Rashad, if you want to take this one, are individual questions weighted differently based on difficulty or the percentage of students who answered it correctly? And as a follow-up question, or I guess it's sort of the same question, or is it just scored on number of correct questions compared to how everyone else performed?
Yeah, so I think the answer is the latter thing that you said. No one question is worth more than another question on the MCAT. There's no penalty for guessing, and you are assessed based on the total number of questions you got right compared to how the other people did in the test. Yep.
All right, and here we have another question. Key, if you want to take this one, the question is there anything that is make or break for MCAT studying?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the one thing that tends to make or break people is having a strategy of some sort, and being intentional about the way that you're studying and sort of the way that you go about things. And so what I would recommend is when you begin studying, you kind of want an idea of how long it's going to be, what test you want to take, how long you kind of want to spend reviewing content, and then how long it'll take you to go through, practice problems, and whether your schedule is clear enough to take practice exams and so on and so forth. So, in short, to answer your question, a strategy is going to make or break your MCAT.
Right, so next, Katherine, we have a question. How do you suggest combating the exam fatigue?
Okay, so exam fatigue really culminates when you start going through the test at a faster pace than is recommended. And I noticed that a lot of my students say, oh, I don't take my full breaks. And that really surprises me. So I want you to utilize your breaks. And there are a lot of things that you can do to wake your mind up during your breaks. So for me, that was I splashed water on my face in the bathroom during my breaks. And I also went in and did some stretching in between sections. And I just would also have a snack between sections. So basically anything that you can do to take your mind off the exam and also just wake yourself up. The second thing that you can do is not during the test, but before the test, you can really start preparing yourself by taking full-length exams, building up the endurance. Like Rishav said, even with the practice materials, you can start doing those timed, so you can make mini sections out of your practice questions. So all of those things will build your endurance, and then on test day, you can always just, if all else fails, just splash your face with water and keep going.
Right, so next, Rashad, we have a question here. What are the must-know signaling pathways?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So I won't go through all of the ones that you need to know, but what I will say is I'll go through the ones that appear most often maybe, but if you'd like to know like whether something appears on the MCAT or not, there's actually an MCAT content outline that is published by the AAMC. And so if there's a specific topic that you're not sure if you need to know it or not, go on there and check see if it appears there. But in terms of the ones that I would say are the most important, like signaling pathways to remember, that every body system is going to have some kind of signaling pathway associated with it. And so for each system, like really understand what are the signaling pathways that make the kidney work or make the heart work. In addition, there's a set of hormones that you should memorize and understand, especially tropic hormones, like which hormones turn on other hormones. And then within biochemistry, there's a lot of metabolic pathways that could be tested on the MCAT, but I would say that the most important ones to understand and really internalize are glycolysis, the pyruvate dehydrogenase pathway, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. So learning, like understanding how a glucose gets broken down all the way to producing ATP.
All right, we have a couple quick ones I'm going to answer. So one is, how can we get access to scientific journal articles, such as those from Nature and Cell? So these you can go to PubMed. So this is essentially a free website that was created by the scientific community for people to be able to find and research scientific journal articles. A lot of those articles you can actually access for free. So those are called the PMC free articles. So if you just do a quick search, you can find a lot of free articles that you can access. There are some articles that require paid access. For those of you who are still in college and in university, there's a pretty good chance that your school provides you with access to those paid subscriptions. And another quick question, do you see mixed inhibitors on the MCAT? And yes, absolutely. And as one of your panelists mentioned earlier, mixed inhibitors, non-competitive inhibitors, some people sort of lump them in as the same, but sort of as a quick explanation, they are not exactly the same thing. Non-competitive inhibitors is a subtype of mixed inhibitors. And you can certainly go online on our Med School Coach YouTube page. We actually have a full video going through the different types of enzyme inhibitors that I can check out. All right, Key, we have a question. How much time to dedicate for the final round of review before test day?
So the final round of review could consist of a number of different things. What I did personally was, about 2 days before taking the MCAT, I stopped doing practice exams, stopped doing practice questions, and just sort of had this pile of flashcards that I just went over again and again, sort of low stress. I wasn't going to freak out if I got anything wrong. But for me, it was 2 days. Some people like to kind of go through all the practice problems that they did and review them again. And that could, take a while depending on how many you've done and how deeply you want to go through them. But that's also up to you. And keep in mind, one part of it is knowing the material and reviewing your strategy and such. And the other part of it is, taking care of yourself before the exam. It's a stressful time. It's, not a fun thing to go through. And so you want to kind of keep yourself in tip-top shape. You don't want to wear yourself down before that 8-hour test.
All right, so next, Katherine, we have a question is about how long would you estimate MCAT prep should take, as in when should someone start prepping?
Okay, so depending on your needs, it could be just a few months. So 3 months is the shortest duration that I would recommend. And I recommend longer if you are currently in school. So if you have classes or work or other commitments, that'll really create an issue with having a short MCAT schedule, because a 3-month schedule with full time, it could get you a 10-point increase, but I couldn't say the same about if you're in school and you're working and you're just studying for 3 months, because the hours that you're studying goes way down. So really you just want to think about the hours that you can put in. So I have looked at some data that suggests that successful MCAT students, they study for around 500 hours. I know that I studied for around 1,000 hours, so that's really what got me to the top percentile. So it's more about the hours that you put in rather than the month. So you should really figure out what will work for you in terms of hours and then go from there to build your study schedule.
All right, and Rashab, we have a question here. for memorizing amino acids, what do you need to know? My understanding is we have to know about classification, acidic, basic, etc., abbreviations, and special characteristics. You might want to turn on your microphone.
Thank you, Ken. So you should definitely be able to categorize your amino acids into like polar, nonpolar, acidic, basic. There's a couple that have sulfur groups on them that are a little bit different. You should know the abbreviations. Something that students forget is if it's acidic or basic, you should know generally around where the pKa is. Those are especially come up quite often on the biochem section. And I think that question also asks, like, should you be able to draw them from scratch? And I would say for me, yeah, it really helped to be able to go through and draw the R group for every single amino acid from scratch. So especially if two amino acids are really similar, so aspartate and glutamate are quite similar. You should know the distinction between them. There's a subtle difference. You should be able to draw that subtle difference.
All right, and we have a few quick questions I'm going to answer. So one is about our tutoring materials. I know I glanced over this quickly, but we essentially provide students all the materials they need to do well on the exam. So that would include the full MCAT video course that covers all the content students need to know for the MCAT, and all the AMC practice questions. So essentially the best study resources available for practice. And we also provide a few additional supplemental resources, such as Picmonic for helping students memorize different terms using visual mnemonics. And there's several more, and if you're interested, you can certainly check them out on our website. We also have a quick question on purchasing tutoring sessions. So of course, our tutoring packages are set up by different numbers of hours, 8, 24, 45, 60, depending on how many hours a student wants to sign up for. It's also possible to sign up for individual tutoring sessions. If you just want to try a session to see what it's like before you commit to a larger package, that's certainly possible as well. You can do that easily just by sending us an email at info@medschoolcoach.com. And of course, a question here asking if our panelists are available for tutoring, and absolutely. So if you want to work with any of our panelists as MCAT tutors, that's certainly possible. So absolutely. Okay. So we have a question here, which is, how did you balance coursework and studying for the MCAT?
Yeah, so I took the MCAT when I was still in school, and one thing that I would recommend is have a large chunk of time that you don't have class for. So for instance, I took the MCAT at the very end of my 6-week-long winter break. And so I started a little bit ahead of that. And so there was a little bit of time when I was doing content review along with class time. That involved basically setting up a calendar, an online calendar. I used Apple Calendar to figure out when I had class, when my exams were, when I had assignments due, so on and so forth, and use that to schedule chunks of time in which I could study different subjects. And so after that, it got much better once I was able to have that winter break to kind of study. Other good times would be summer vacation, or if you graduate like I did in December, a lot of people take that excess semester to study for the MCAT. But if you have to study for the MCAT, concurrently with class, I would recommend using a scheduling tool, and really, like Katherine said, making sure you have an adequate number of hours to put into the MCAT.
All right, and here, Katherine, we have a question, and that is, what can one do the week before the exam to physically and mentally prepare for a 7-hour test?
Okay, so by the week before, you should really have done a lot of practice exams. So by that point, you should feel pretty confident that you can get through an 8-hour, or it's really a 7.5-hour test. So that's something that you should be working on over a longer period of time than just 1 week, because that will be a total shock to your system if you just decide that you're going to start sitting down for almost 8 hours a day for an entire week. So that's something that you should do ahead of time, but you can prepare yourself for the exam by having a rest day before the exam. So what I did is I got a massage, I got my nails done, I tried not to look at MCAT material, and that really cleared my head and made me feel like I was confident going into the exam. So you want to avoid anything that will take down your confidence right before test day. So don't look at the hardest material the day before. It will make you feel bad and you'll probably just start to doubt yourself. So I highly recommend starting early with that endurance practice and then leading up to the exam doing a light review, and then the day before having a day to relax. So that's how I would prepare for the real test day.
All right, and we've had a few of the same questions. So one is this presentation or webinar going to be available for later review? And absolutely. Again, shortly after this webinar is going to be on our Med School Coach YouTube page. So you can watch this webinar as well as any of our previous webinars on there. Another question I've gotten several times is, how many hours did each of our tutors or panelists spend studying for the MCAT? So if each of you want to go ahead and answer that real quick, so we can go with the same order here. So Rishabh, then Katherine, then Keith.
Sure. So I've actually never calculated the number of hours, but I spent about 4 months studying, and I'd say I did about 20 hours a week. And so that's 320 hours. I wish I'd done more, but like some of you guys, I was working full time plus taking MCAT, and I really struggle with finding a balance between my job and studying. But yeah, about 400 hours is what I did.
Okay, and I already kind of answered this. I studied for around 1,000 hours. So I studied all the way from March until an August test date. So I was studying full-time during the summer and then part-time during school. And I just really like studying, so I didn't mind all that much, but a lot of students probably wouldn't want to put in that much time, and it's totally possible to get a high score without doing 1,000 hours of studying.
I'll preface this by saying I would not recommend anybody follow my study schedule. I spent about 2 months at about 40 to 50 hours a week. Would not recommend.
All right, so, and that of course can be a difficult question to answer because every student is different. So, you should certainly try or do what works best for you. And certainly by the time you take the MCAT, you will have taken a number of courses already. You should hopefully by then have figured out what works best for you. All right, so next, let's see, we have a question here. Rishabh, if you want to take this one. So the question is about, what should the ratio between content review and practice be?
So this will vary a little bit depending on how quick of a reader you are. So every student should go through, in my opinion, a set of like content review books for the MCAT, cover to cover. And some students finish that quite quickly, like in a month, maybe a month and a half. And some of my students will take all longer, 3 months, 4 months to get through that. And so for the content review, it's however much time it takes you to get from cover to cover through all of your books. For the targeted review, you should at the bare minimum go through and do all of the AMC questions and review all the questions that you got wrong or had trouble, had to guess on. And for that, it should take about 120 to 150 hours, depending on the student. And so I'm sure I couldn't give you a ratio, but I would say however long it takes you to get through all of your textbooks, usually about 2 months for most of my students, and then about 150 hours to bare minimum to do practice and review.
All right, and Key, we have a question here is, do you have any tips to increase speed? I usually run out of time on the first 3 sections.
Yeah, so one thing I would recommend is when you go through your practice materials, and like we've discussed, the AMC materials are the most faithful to the exam. You want to do those at the proper pacing of the exam. So a lot of people kind of go through and take as much time as they want and figure, now that I know the material, I'll go through faster and faster. I would start from the beginning and kind of get sort of a muscle memory-esque feel for how long it should take you to answer each question, whether you're spending too much time on a question, and whether you should just move on. And so the best tip that I have is practice like you're going to take the exam. The second sort of auxiliary tip that I would have is identify what's taking you that much time, or what's kind of slowing you down. And if it's content review, you want to bolster that. If it's being able to process the material, like Rishav recommended, you might want to go through on PubMed and look at some journals, kind of familiarize yourself with that, and triage and sort of fix whatever issue you might be experiencing sort of more specifically.
All right, and here we have a question, and Katherine. So the question we have is, I haven't finished all my content review. I've got about 5.5 weeks left, and probably about 35% to 40% of the content left to get through. Any tips on how to speed up content review?
Okay, so if you have just that amount of time leading up to test day, you definitely need to start incorporating some practice in there as well. So in this type of situation, it's more important to get practice in than it is to get all the content in. So you should start mixing some of your practice in with your content review. The way that you can get through it faster is really just, instead of reading and taking notes, if that's something that you're doing, you can just read. But really, this is a situation where no matter what you do, it will affect the quality of your studies from here on out, and it will affect your score to some degree because you aren't able to get through all the content, and you're definitely not going to be able to get in all the practice. So if I had a student with a situation like that, that's when we might start talking about pushing the test date just to make sure that you're as prepared as you can be for the exam.
All right, and with that, it's actually all the time we have for today. So I want to thank all of you as well as all of our panelists for joining us today. Again, lots of fantastic questions. And if you have more questions or want to learn about how we can help, certainly check out our website or send us an email at info@medschoolcoach.com. Otherwise, again, this webinar is going to be up on our YouTube page very shortly. So feel free to check that out as well as any of the other fantastic videos we have on there. And with that, I hope you all have a great rest of your evening.